Howdy doody folks, I hope you're doing well, and let's be clear, folklore doesn't always revolve around ghosts or a cryptid. Sometimes the talk of the town is some buried treasure or stolen treasure, a trap in the woods designed to capture a mythical beast, or even that friend of yours that loves karaoke but breaks windows every time he sings. What I'm trying to say is ghosts and ghouls don't deserve all the credit, and my favorite urban legends aren't even scary at all. That's why I'm devoting this video to local folklore surrounding places and things that are just downright unusual in Oregon. Now, before we get started, I just want to say that Oregon appears to be especially strange, and if you decide that you're enjoying this video and want more, I'd be open to doing a part 2 for this state, so let me know if you want a part 2 in the comments. Beyond this, if you decide you like me, the best thing you can do for me is subscribe, like the video, and most importantly, watch until the end. It'll never cost you a dime, and with this in mind, come with me today and let's see what Oregon's got in store in the weird department. Now, don't take this the wrong way, but among the strangest and most amazing outcomes of geological events I've ever read about when considering its impact in culture is a feature described as the Bridge of the Gods by Native Americans, a land bridge that formed before Westerners colonized the Americas that connected the two sides of the Columbia River, joining modern-day Oregon and Washington, and essentially forming a natural dam across. This dam formed, it's thought, when a chunk of Table Mountain broke off, likely due to an earthquake, causing a massive landslide with material sliding into the Columbia River Gorge and halting the river's flow near the modern-day Cascade Locks region in Oregon. Today, you can actually still see this evidence of where Table Mountain broke off. The landslide during which all of this occurred is referred to as the Bonneville Slide. Now, as for when this occurred, it's very disputed to say the least. But I think it's my duty to present a couple of the many contested viewpoints on the matter. Recent work using radiocarbon dating and lichenometry suggests this landslide occurred between 1500 and 1760 AD, or as early as between 1670 and 1760 AD, a time period which aligns well with the 1700 Cascadia earthquake. Even more recent investigations using radiocarbon dating and dendrochronology show the landslide could have occurred around 1450, which could perhaps be associated with an earlier great earthquake that occurred in the mid-15th century. Heck, there are even some older studies that suggest the Bridge of the Gods formed around 1060 AD, although now these dates seem to largely be considered premature. Now, regardless of when it occurred, the Bonneville landslide sent debris south from Table Mountain and also the nearby Greenleaf Peak, covering an area of more than 5.5 square miles, much of the debris falling into the Columbia Gorge close to the modern-day Cascade Locks, Oregon, and blocking the Columbia River, creating a natural dam that was about 200 feet in height and 3.5 miles in length, drowning upstream forests, and most importantly culturally, creating a land bridge that to this day is recounted in native oral history, where you will hear legends of people crossing the Columbia River on foot. Now, of course, today the Columbia River flows, so we already know that this natural dam didn't last forever, rather eroding away and eventually breaking through, washing away much of the debris and forming the Cascades Rapids, a feature which today is submerged after the construction of the Bonneville Dam on the Columbia. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't discuss a couple of the many Native American legends that explain the creation and destruction of this feature known as the Bridge of the Gods, as they're pretty great tales, and they also tell of the creation of many of the other mountains in the region. Perhaps the most famous of these stories is told by the Klickitats. In this tale, the chief of all gods and his two sons, Pato and Waist, traveled down the Columbia River from the far north in search of a place to settle. During these travels, they came across an area now known as the Dalles. The area they stumbled upon here was beautiful, and the sons fought over the ownership of the area. The chief of all gods in his wisdom shot 2 arrows, one to the north and one to the south, ordering his sons to settle separately across the river and stop fighting. And then the god built the Bridge of the Gods so that his family could meet now and again. Of course, this tale does end, and in its end, it tells the tale of the collapse of the Bridge of the Gods. and this tale, of course, follows a love quarrel between the two brothers. The sons apparently had similar taste in women, and both fell in love with the same beautiful maiden, a woman named Luet, who could not choose between the two. In their fight over her love, they created quite a bit of destruction, devastating the land and destroying the Bridge of the Gods that joined their territories, creating the Cascade Rapids of the Columbia River Gorge. These two, after seeing their destruction, were struck down by their father, after which they were transformed into mountains where they fell. Weist, with his head lifted proudly into the air, became Mount Hood. Pato, with his head bent towards his fallen love, was turned into Mount Adams. Luet, the woman they were fawning over, also passed away in this struggle and became a mountain too, the youngest of them all, Mount St. Helens. There's also another legend I should tell you about the formation of these mountains and of the Bridge of the Gods, as well as the destruction of the Bridge of the Gods, and this is it. In this one, the people of the Columbia River had great difficulty crossing the Columbia River because of its width and strong currents. However, one of the gods, named Manito, the Great Spirit, was a sympathetic god, and he therefore built them a stone bridge, which they referred to as the Bridge of the Gods, or the Great Crossover. This crossover was so crucial that Manito placed an old wise woman named Luet as its guardian. Around the same time, the god sent his sons to Earth, the three great snow mountains, Mount Rainier, Mount Adams, and Mount Hood. And as with most stories about men, these dudes were vibing together with no drama. That is until a looker came by and they couldn't keep themselves in check. And just who was this looker? Well, she was Squaw Mountain. Of course, Squaw Mountain wasn't easy to tame. She fell in love with Mount Hood, but despite this, she apparently found it fun to flirt with Mount Adams. And the two mountains, Mount Hood and Adams, began to quarrel, spewing clouds and black smoke from their mountaintops, as well as hurling white-hot rocks, setting the forest around them on fire. This quarrel shook the earth so much that the bridge broke in the middle, and the Bridge of the Gods fell into the Columbia River, creating the rapids that followed the bridge's collapse. Now, ultimately, this struggle was won by Mount Adams, and Mount Hood admitted defeat. This broke Squaw Mountain's heart, as she loved Mount Hood, and because of this, she fell into a permanent deep sleep due to a broken heart. This is why Squaw Mountain today is known as the Sleeping Beauty that lies just to the west of Mount Adams. Additionally, Mount Adams' fate caused him such grief and shame that he dropped his head and never raised it again. During this war, Luet, the old woman who was the bridge's guardian, tried to stop the fight but failed and fell with the bridge. The Great Spirit, though, apparently heard of her faithfulness to this cause and decided to grant her wish to be young and beautiful again, and the Spirit turned her into Mount St. Helens, the youngest mountain in all of the Cascades. Now, there are a handful of other legends, too, that tell these stories, but these two were relatively prominently told, so I decided to share these. Of course, nothing particularly grand stands where this Bridge of the Gods once did, unless you count a modern toll road that was built in the approximate location of this old bridge that now bears its name, the Bridge of the Gods. This bridge was built in 1926 and raised in 1936 to accommodate the rising waters from the construction of the nearby Bonneville Dam in 1927. Frankly, in my humble opinion, it's pretty lofty for what is frankly an ugly bridge like this to carry the name Bridge of the Gods, but hey, what do I know? I'm just a YouTuber. Supposedly, in the hills near Tillamook, Oregon, early trappers of the region heard whispers about a place where the Chinook natives were acquiring droves of gold of the highest quality, but any inquiry into where this gold came from was met with silence and skeptical native individuals that were inclined to keep this information to themselves. Despite this, their willingness to trade the golden nuggets they came across was more than enough fuel for the fire of folklore even back in the day, and caused rampant speculation that there may have been a proper gold mine in the hills of Tillamook, just waiting to be found. This story starts near modern-day Gales Creek, a place that back in the day was named Gales City. This locale was apparently the most common place to come across native individuals trading high-quality golden nuggets originally, although a local shop owner in town apparently became aggressive in his inquiry about where the gold came from, making the natives paranoid and leading them to flat-out avoid Gale City because of the correctly presumed threat that settlers would find their source of gold or harass them for their gold. Moving on from Gale City, they decided to take their business to the nearby town of Forest Grove. In particular, natives there were known to frequent a shop known as Cornelius's Mercantile, which was owned by one Colonel T.H. Cornelius. Here they would pay in pure gold, and in exchange they would be given credit. Often they'd come for this credit or pay off their credit lines after a period of just a few days, during which they'd disappear into the nearby hills of the region, leading individuals to suspect their gold source was nearby. Now, this location didn't seem any safer for them than the original Gales Creek, to be frank, as one day some individuals, settlers, followed them from the store to find their gold source and actually ended up capturing the natives, threatening them with death if they didn't tell them the source of the gold. Despite these threats, in this instance, the natives wouldn't tell. Lucky for them, in this case, it seems the ruffians were just bluffing and didn't actually follow through with their threats, at least in this particular instance. Now, this wasn't the last episode, though. Later on, two settlers held up two natives, a father and son, and they found that they had 60 pounds of gold in their packs. They proceeded to question the duo about where they got their gold, but as always, the natives wouldn't budge, and this deplorable pair of settlers decided to kill the native individuals they'd captured and take their gold with them. It's worth noting there was also another episode unrelated to the gold around this period when a native individual was murdered in a brawl in a nearby saloon. Now, as the story goes, following the deaths of these three natives, the superstition surrounding the mining of gold from wherever this mine was grew out of hand, and the natives decided that they would never mine gold from it again, concealing the mine. They essentially thought the mine was cursed by native spirits who had become angry at them for taking and trading the gold, and therefore the death of three of their kin was some sort of revenge for this. At this point, the tale of these gold mines supposedly died down, at least for a while. Natives apparently were no longer wandering the area with gold, and speculation about where the gold came from died down simultaneously. Later on, though, more was to come of this. A family of settlers apparently ended up settling on the Trask floodplain near modern Tillamook, and this family ended up hiring a Chinook housekeeper. As the story goes, they treated this housekeeper with nothing but respect, and the housekeeper became fond of them, in particular of their daughter. This housekeeper fell ill, though, and on her deathbed, she decided to tell the daughter a family story about a lost gold mine. In this story, she essentially told of the prior tale, and here we learn that this housekeeper was once the wife of a man who was killed alongside his son while toting gold mined from a local gold mine. And after telling this tale, she gave the daughter directions to the mine. This daughter would apparently go on to mine this gold, as in adulthood she went on to get in an accident at one point, falling off of a horse, and the man that came to her aid was given some gold nuggets by her for his bravery, which she told him she got from a Chinook gold mine in a nearby mountain, offering him the clue that the mine was in a black canyon where a stream empties into a small lake, before passing away from her injuries. Of course, if you get a deathbed confession that there be gold in those mountains, you don't just willy-nilly let that fly past you. The man ended up dropping everything and selling all of his belongings in pursuit of this gold. And, well, he was definitely unsuccessful at this task, bummer for him, but his neighbor, who was apparently eavesdropping on his every word, had more success. He ended up retracing the man's steps, and his neighbor ended up stumbling upon a mine near the crest of a ridge that had been filled in. But in the adjacent canyon, he found piles of quartz and small golden nuggets. He tried to uncover the filled-in mine, but upon doing so, he was met by horsemen, demanding he leave and that the mine was on private property. He apparently returned a few times to try to unearth it, but was found repeatedly. And then he died in a car accident, as all great treasure hunters do. So this is essentially the story. But before we move on, let's ponder two questions. One, whether this story is even credible, and two, If it is, where's the location of the gold mine? Now, regarding its credibility, it does seem that gold did exist, as there are many accounts of individuals going from Forest Grove and back in 2 to 3 days with gold to pay their bills and purchase goods. It seems unlikely to me that so many accounts of the gold and suspicion about the gold would exist if it weren't real. This being said, was there really a mine that it came from? This is unclear to me. It's entirely possible that rather than finding a mine, cached gold may have been found. Maybe natives found a shipwreck. Maybe they were given gold as payment. There are many ways gold could have ended up in their hands. Regarding where this mine may be, if there really was a gold mine, I did stumble upon an interesting video by a fellow YouTuber that covered this, Brian Outdoors P&W. He actually had a great idea of looking into the etymology of nearby lakes between our 2 points of interest, Gales Creek and the Trask floodplain. And he found a lake named Skookum Lake. Now, this lake's etymology seemed to suggest that there were negative connotations with it, such as evil spirits, in the Native American etymology at least, aligning with their belief that bad juju had essentially come upon natives from mining gold from it, leading them to shut it down. Among Western settlers, there was also superstition about the lake, and generally it was thought that there was some sort of monster dwelling inside of it, scaring off natives and settlers alike. Additionally, I think the resounding opinion about where this mine may be, if real, is that we should follow the woman's hint that the treasure was in a black canyon where a stream empties into a small lake. From this, we can surmise that we should be looking for small lakes with a steep canyon nearby that, at least during some portions of the year, would be constantly steeped in shadow. So anyways, that's about as far as I can take this legend without personally doing some treasure hunting. But if you know more about this treasure or have heard your own local take on this urban legend, I'd love to hear more in the comments. Now, usually in one of these videos, I'll cover a big teapot or maybe a giant coffee pot. And not to throw shade at those, but Oregon, by golly, you've got the coolest weird thing that you can step inside so far in my journey through the USA. See, one of these so-called goofy things in this video we're covering is no simple upsized container for liquids, but rather a contraption built to capture the mythical beast Bigfoot himself. In the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest in Jackson County, Oregon, basically like really far south where Oregon borders on California, there's a weird looking box, or maybe weird shed in the woods, that's about 10 by 10 feet or 3 by 3 meters in size, made of planks that are held together by heavy metal bindings. This shed-like object was built in 1974 by a group called the North American Wildlife Research Team, which was essentially a very official name for a group in the region whose sole purpose was to capture and prove the existence of Bigfoot himself, perhaps being inspired by the nearby Patterson-Gimlin footage that was taken just about 100 miles away. Back when they built this trap, this area was remote, and I mean like remote. There were no houses, there were tons of bears, and if you went for a backcountry hike, you might not see another person for days. In the eyes of this organization, this might have been the perfect location to go on a hunt for a foot, so they built this contraption just to do that. This so-called Bigfoot Trap was built with a U.S. Forest Service special use permit, and it's secured to the ground with telephone poles, and has a solid steel front door suspended to the structure to withstand blows from a creature of incredible power. It was built so that if a sufficiently heavy creature got inside of it, it would spring shut. Now, the man who really spearheaded the construction of this trap was a local miner named Perry Lovell who lived in the area, and when he was mining, he became convinced that he was hearing large creatures roaming the area at night. He often even thought he saw a Bigfoot, or something large at least, just roaming right beyond the tree line from him. He even once woke up to find 18-inch long human-like footprints around his garden, according to him at least. Now, these stories and the motivation of the North American Wildlife Research Team collided and convinced the team to build a Bigfoot trap to once and for all conclude that the foot was real. When they were looking for the creature, they'd bait the trap with rabbit, goat, and other animals, hoping to lure in Bigfoot, But in my eyes, this is probably where they went wrong. They were probably really close to catching Bigfoot, but their choice of bait was definitely the screw-up. See, Bigfoot isn't some savage. He's clearly not going to eat raw meat, but if they left some beer out there for him, I bet he'd swing by. See, Bigfoot always seemed like a lager guy to me. Maybe an amber ale or a porter in the winter. I bet Bigfoot would love a good beer, but I digress. Anyways, wherever the trap was sprung, an alarm would sound at a watchman's cabin that was nearby, and this cabin was apparently constantly being manned by NAWRT volunteer, and they thought once they caught the squatch, they'd just tranquilize him, tag him, and photograph it before releasing it back into the wild. Now, while this plan was certainly more elegant than you'd expect for a Bigfoot hunting organization, in the 6 years that the trap was manned, it had little success. Reports about it vary, but in general, they say the trap caught 6 bears, a hippie, and 1 hunter. Regardless, in 1980, with the advent of the nearby Applegate River Dam, the Bigfoot trap was abandoned because the area became too populated, and for a while, it was forgotten. That is, until 2006, when some Forest Service workers decided they should repair and preserve the structure, as well as weld its door open as part of the Passport in Time program. Nowadays, while still unable to catch a foot, this trap is a tourist attraction that you should absolutely swing by if you're in Southern Oregon. On Wednesday, November 24th, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, a man walked into the Portland International Airport and, under the guise of a name, Dan Cooper, purchased a one-way airline ticket with Northwest Airlines to go from Portland to Seattle on flight number 305. By all accounts, this man did not stand out, as before the events we'll discuss transpired, I haven't seen a single account of him being noticed in the airport terminal after purchasing his ticket. He was in his mid-40s. He wore a suit, a white shirt and a coat, and brown shoes. He was also wearing a black tie and had a briefcase, and he had a brown paper bag with him. Upon boarding the plane, he beckoned the flight attendant over and ordered a bourbon and a soda, also reportedly lighting a cigarette, and calmly enjoying his vices before the plane took off at around 3 p.m. About 10 minutes into this flight, though, this man, Dan Cooper, retrieved a note from his pocket nonchalantly, and he handed it to a flight attendant, one Florence Schaffner, who initially put the note in her pocket to read later. Apparently this wasn't part of Cooper's plan, though, because after she pocketed it, he said, "Miss, you'd better take a look at that note. I have a bomb." Anyways, after telling her this, which, to be frank, I think telling her this in the first place was not part of his plan, he asked the stewardess to sit down next to him, and he lifted his briefcase and opened it to expose to her that inside of his briefcase there was an explosive device with wires and 8 red sticks that were possibly dynamite. He then instructed her to take notes on what he was demanding and let the captain know immediately. His demands were $200,000, which he wanted upon landing, exclusively in $20 denominations, in a knapsack, and in negotiable American currency. He wanted 2 front parachutes and 2 back parachutes, and when they landed, he demanded there immediately be a fuel truck prepared to refuel the plane. He also made the iconic assertion, "No funny stuff, or I'll do the job." As for these demands, I think there are a few interesting points here that will help us later. To start, what kind of hijacker specifies to an American flight attendant on an American flight that is passing between 2 American cities that the currency he be provided be negotiable American currency? I'd think that would be pretty implicit. Additionally, his demand of 4 parachutes is notable because it likely means he was either initially planning on taking a hostage or wanted the FBI to think he was taking a hostage so that they didn't sabotage any of the parachutes, likely the latter. It's worth noting, in documents we have access to today, the FBI actually did consider sabotaging the chutes, but decided against it when he requested 4, not wanting to harm a hostage. For the rest of the flight, after these demands were made, a stewardess remained by Cooper's side with a telephone at the ready to relay any instructions to the rest of the flight crew. As preparations were being made, the flight circled around the Seattle International Airport for about an hour and a half before landing to give the ground-based team time to procure everything that Cooper was demanding, and the flight landed at about 5:45 p.m., In exchange for his demands, Cooper allowed the 36 passengers aboard off, in addition to a few of the crew members. He then demanded the crew take off from Mexico City along with some remaining crew members, requesting the plane stay below 10,000 feet. It's worth noting the pilot himself chose the route of the plane, not Cooper. Cooper only chose the end destination, with the pilot choosing a route known as Victor 23. This seems to suggest Cooper was acting alone, as it would have been difficult to coordinate with a ground-based pickup if there was no set route. Additionally, at this time, he apparently negotiated with the flight crew about a refueling stop along the way, as the flight from Seattle to Mexico was not possible without one, so they decided they would land in Reno. Cooper instructed them to fly with the landing gear down and the flaps at 15 degrees, as well as below 10,000 feet. He also demanded he be shown how to lower the aft stairway of the plane after he realized they couldn't take off with the aft stairway down. Now, after all of this, the flight took off at 7:45 p.m., being escorted by 2 fighter jets, and shortly after takeoff, Cooper demanded the flight crew go into the forward cabin and that he not be disturbed. He was last seen in the middle of the aisle, looking as if he was preparing to jump, with a pair of dark-rimmed wraparound sunglasses across his face that would stay over his head during the jump from the plane. At around 8:10 to 8:15 most likely, the flight crew felt the cabin oscillate, and they believed that this was the point at which Cooper jumped from the cabin. He was not seen to do this by the crew or the 2 pursuing fighter jets. This jumping point would likely put him in a mountainous, but also heavily forested region, a region that would be perilous to land in, but that would also make a search for Cooper difficult. While this seems risky, I can see how it could have been potentially unimportant to Cooper what direction his flight was going, if he were planning to jump shortly after takeoff anyways. No matter what direction you head from Seattle, regardless of the route, you're quickly going to be surrounded by pretty thick forests and harsh topography that would make a ground search extremely challenging. Now, about 3 hours after this, they landed in Reno, damaging the plane when they landed with the aft staircase down, and the flight crew cautiously investigated the cabin, finding that Cooper was no longer aboard, correctly assuming that after extending the aft stairway, he'd leapt from the plane into the dark of night. The FBI, of course, quickly boarded the plane and started to collect evidence. They found a black clip-on tie, cigarette butts, which, from what I can tell, were actually lost before they could be analyzed, and 2 of the 4 parachutes. Ultimately, outside of the plane, very little was found to indicate the position that Cooper jumped from. From what I can tell, a sticker or piece of paper affixed to the aft staircase did fall off of the plane and was found in the search area north of Portland. Perhaps more importantly was that in February of 1910, a young boy named Brian Ingram found a buried package filled with $20 bills of matching serial numbers to those given to Dan Cooper on a beach named Tina Bar. As for how those got there, the gut reaction folks have is that the money likely fell into a nearby river and was washed ashore there, but this process would have taken a substantial amount of time, and it was shown in laboratory testing that if exposed to air for a year, the rubber bands on this package holding the money together would have snapped. This means the money was likely buried at Tina Bar shortly after the hijacking, perhaps suggesting the intervention of Cooper, or maybe the individual that found his body. Next question, though. Who was Dan Cooper? Now, I don't mean this in a specific sense yet, but more like what facts can we gather about him that hint to who he was in life? To start, well, we need to ignore the B in D.B. Cooper, hence why I keep calling him Dan Cooper. The B was actually just a clerical error made by the media. D.B. Cooper was never a name he gave to anybody. There was, however, a French comic book series about a pilot named Dan Cooper that was actually sold in Canada, and let's keep in mind, when negotiating his deal, Dan flat out said negotiable American currency, something interesting but perhaps meaningless, but, consider if you were an American living in America, would you ever in your right mind specify to the U.S. government of all people that you wanted to be given U.S. dollars? I sure wouldn't. Additionally, his parachute choices were interesting. You'd think that someone pulling this heist off would be relatively comfortable with skydiving, but his choice of parachutes was confusing to say the least. Remember, he was given 4 parachutes, 2 primaries, 2 secondaries. One of the primary chutes was steerable, and the other was a non-steerable military-style chute. Also, only one of these secondary chutes was actually functional, with the other being a dummy chute that was sewn shut. Now, with these 4 choices in front of him, Dan Cooper chose what at face value is the worst of the 4 options. He chose the non-steerable primary chute, the military variety, and the dummy secondary chute. Now, to play devil's advocate, while this could have indicated poor decisions on his part, this could have also indicated that he had a military background and that he was familiar with the non-steerable military chute. And it's also worth noting he may have tried to stow away the money he'd been given inside of the second dummy chute that was actually partially sewn shut. He was actually seen trying to do this with the other secondary chute. Additionally, maybe this military background aligns well with something he said to the flight attendants during the flight. One of them asked him essentially, "Why us? Why this airline? Why are you hijacking us in particular?" To which he responded that it wasn't because he had a grudge towards their airline or the people, it's just because he had a grudge. Perhaps less understandable than his parachute choice, however, is the fact that Cooper chose to jump at night, into the rain, over a wooded area with little to no visibility, and thick cloud cover into 200-mile-an-hour winds while wearing clothing that were by all accounts not adequate for the task he was undertaking. This led many to speculate that Cooper just died following this jump. But let's be clear, no body was ever found, and the only proper evidence of this case found outside of the plane was the money that was buried at Tina Bar. Now, as for who Dan Cooper might have really been, there are tons of suspects, so I'm just going to describe a couple. These couple will give you a general idea of who the FBI was honing in on. To start, one of the favorite suspects is Richard Floyd McCoy, an individual who also hijacked and parachuted out of a similar plane. This individual had served in Vietnam, and during his hijacking, he also passed a note to a flight attendant saying no funny stuff. This individual was ruled out as Cooper, however, because he didn't match the physical description of Cooper, despite having huge ears like the Cooper drawing. He also came much better equipped than Cooper did to jump out of the plane. He had an actual helmet and a defined route where he wanted the plane to fly. In short, he basically conducted an identical heist to that of Cooper, but the flight attendants didn't think he resembled Cooper. Some may think he may have just been a copycat. There's also Dwayne Weber, an individual who claimed to be D.B. Cooper on his deathbed. He also had huge ears and apparently had, in life, told his wife about a nightmare he had about leaving fingerprints on the aft stairs of a plane. Also, in his possessions, he kept an old airline ticket from Northwest Airlines, and he had a knee injury that he claimed he got from jumping out of a plane. Now, these suspects are often the favorites, but there are many, many more. Like, I could make this a 5 or 6 hour video just listing off the suspects. However, I found it pretty interesting how many people not only had the background to pull off a heist like this, but how many of them had apparent motives, and most importantly, had huge ears that fit the description of Dan Cooper. Now, as of now, this case is unresolved, and it actually closed in 2016, but apparently the FBI remains open to leads, and as from what I can tell, the statute of limitations on this case will never expire. So, if you have leads, hit up the FBI. I'm sure they'd love to hear them. Alright, to be clear, this one is super gross, but I heard about this when I was a kid and barely knew what the Pacific Northwest was, which tells me it's a truly iconic, pervasive piece of Oregon folklore. As the story goes, on November 9th of 1970 in Florence, Oregon, a tragically lifeless sperm whale washed ashore on the shores of Florence Beach. This 8-ton and 45-foot school bus-sized behemoth was not only dead, but stinky as all get out, and it just sat on a beach, decaying for days and punishing anyone foolish enough to sit upwind of it. Of course, when the Oregon Department of Transportation, the department with jurisdiction over this, got wind of the matter, they knew they had to do something. Many options were considered, many reasonable ones, like cutting it up or burying it, and they could have even left it out there, although decomposing would take quite a while. But they ended up going with the fun option, and they decided they were going to blow it up and propel this event into immortality. Now, with news brewing that they'd be blowing up a whale to let scavengers eat its remains, the media had a field day, and apparently news anchors from across the state flocked to Florence Beach to see the show. And once there, they started asking questions that apparently harmed the highway engineer's ego, as he didn't have good answers and got a little fussy, which we'll get to. But in short, it seems like rather than doing the math on how to properly blow up a whale in a specific direction, they just said, a ton of dynamite will do, and they went on to put 20 50-pound cases of dynamite around the whale, hoping they'd blast it into the sea. And, well, blow it up they did. Chunks of whale meat began to fall, well, everywhere. And not small pieces either. Some huge ones fell. Chunks big enough that this poor guy's car actually got crushed, which is kind of ironic because this dude apparently actually warned the highway engineer that exactly this was going to happen if they blew up the whale in the fashion they were planning. Now, funny enough, the Oldsmobile of his that got crushed was sold to the man literally under the premise that he was getting a whale of a deal, and he was luckily reimbursed by the state. Ultimately, large pieces of the whale remained, which they ended up just burying with a bulldozer. But hey, this was an incredibly fun experiment. Sadly, apparently the scavengers they thought would consume the rest of the whale once broken apart, seagulls principally, wanted nothing to do with it. They were actually scared off by the explosion and didn't come back for weeks. The demolition expert or highway engineer in charge of this ordeal, of course, blamed the media for all of his problems, taking no responsibility and claiming nothing went wrong. Just a quick reminder, you're the one that was in charge of the TNT, not the media. Now, luckily, 9 years later, when, sadly, 41 sperm whales beached south of Florence, they opted to bury them instead, and this is now Oregon's official policy. Sadly, no more blowing up whales in Oregon. Or maybe that's a good thing, I don't know. Regardless, where this occurred, it is now, I kid you not, Exploding Whale Memorial Park. Now, being a geologically active and coastal area of the country, it's no surprise that we're covering not one, but two strange artifacts left behind by natural processes. Among these strange but mesmerizing artifacts is something referred to as the Neskowin Ghost Forest. Now, usually on this channel, when we talk about ghosts, it's about those of people, and sometimes those of cats or horses. But here, we're talking about those of trees. The thing is, these ghost trees aren't just an urban legend. You can go and see them for yourself. Before the late 1990s, it's worth noting that nobody knew of this so-called ghost forest, but winter storms in 1997 and 98 eroded away tons of sand and unearthed strange features peeking out from beneath the ground, prominent tree stumps. I should note, how these trees came to be preserved is a bit of a mystery in and of itself. Some believe that these trees became buried and preserved in sand following significant and rapid changes in coastlines due to seismic events. Other theories actually suspect this change was more gradual, with these trees slowly being covered by sand and then encroached upon and killed by saltwater over the course of decades. This method is actually the way that most ghost forests in Oregon were formed, and from what I can tell seems to be the favored method by which this one was formed too. The distinction between these formations is important scientifically, by the way, because it helps experts understand and model future outcomes related to this process. Now, as for when the ghost forest occurred, radiocarbon dating has revealed that these stumps are about 2,000 years old, and in their heyday, these trees were similar to those that make up today's coastal rainforest of the region. It's likely this forest was about 150 to 200 feet in height, and that these trees were 200 years old when they were buried and submerged in saltwater and sand. They were subsequently preserved by this sand, though, paradoxically I suppose, because it detached them from much of the oxygen and bacteria that would decay the stumps. Now, besides all the details, if you want to see these beautiful and old stumps for yourself, you can visit the forest. It's near Proposal Rock within the Neskowin Beach State Recreation Site. At low tide, especially in the winter, you can see many of these old tree stumps peering back at you from the sandy beach. These days, it's worth noting, while they're clearly still tree stumps, they are covered in barnacles, and some of them even contain their own little tide pools, equipped with anemones and all. In 1931, folks spotted something in the Columbia River off of Portland, Oregon. This something was an orca whale, or killer whale, and for days, this orca was sighted swimming in the Columbia River, which I should note was not exactly well kept at the time. It was really polluted. But regardless, people began to fall in love with the little creature that migrated 100 miles up the Columbia River to grace the eyes of the residents of Portland, Oregon. Along the way, their affection for this orca gave way to a name, Ethelbert. Now, the newly named Ethelbert, however, was not exactly as safe as you might expect. Whaling was ongoing in the Pacific Northwest region, and there were no protections for whales that traveled inland. And most damning, people before the 1930s, as we all know, apparently had a natural inclination to just try and kill anything they saw that was even slightly unusual and display it for profit. With Ethelbert, it was the same. Practically as soon as she was seen, folks generally just wanted to catch or kill poor Ethelbert and display her. Things were apparently getting absolutely insane in Portland on this front. Folks were lining up with their rifles along the shores of the Columbia and legitimately just shooting out at the orca from shore, trying to fell her. Now, luckily, the governor of Oregon had the sense to order this to stop, but some didn't heed this warning, even thinking that the unclean waters were killing the poor whale. Now, I should make it clear, this was absolutely speculation and was not reported fact. But despite this, even the Oregon Humane Society, for some reason, was urging the whale to be put down and suggesting that dynamite be used to do it. I'm picturing the Death Star explosion in my head right now. Regardless, apparently things were looking grim for the whale because it had been hit by a few of the bullets from shore and its wounds were starting to fester. Now, all of this was motivation enough for one duo, Edward Lasar and his son Joseph, who went out into the Columbia River and just shot the whale in the head, killing it. Luckily, this didn't come without consequences, of course. The two were charged with disturbing the peace, killing a fish with illegal tackle, and fishing in the slough with illegal tackle. Ultimately, though, these charges didn't stick, and after a legal battle, they had the whale seized from them by the state. But sadly, they got it back for the fee of $103 for some reason. Despite all of this, though, at the very least, the Lasards gained the title of the meanest men in the world by the media, which I wholeheartedly agree with. Poor whale. The Lasards, of course, being mean men, didn't care about this title, though, and began exhibiting Ethelbert in a custom-made tank for quite some time. Although eventually the public lost interest in seeing this pickled whale up close, and their little tourist attraction shut down, and Ethelbert disappeared for about 40 years. Now, a curious thing I'm finding about people throughout the series is that while we often physically forget where we put things, or sometimes forget the facts surrounding situations, we still tell stories about true things and we don't even know it. That's the beautiful thing about folklore. And in this light, while Ethelbert herself was forgotten about, there were apparently urban legends that there was a preserved whale in the mountains across the Columbia River from Portland, Oregon. These rumors caught the attention of a man named Bill Farr in 1969, who actually was devoting his spare time to researching the creature, and he came across old newspaper articles painting the Lasard family as the ones responsible for the whale's procurement. And then he found the location of some old Lasard family property, seeing in the paperwork associated with it that there was a fee for storage of a fish that had been paid for years. This gave him a probable location for the whale, and after a bit of running around in the mountains with his daughter, Bill and her found a box in an overgrown clearing. There, they opened it and found preserved in formaldehyde Ethelbert, who remained in one piece, and apparently even in extremely good condition. As it turned out, there really was a whale in the mountains across the river from Portland. This news ultimately reached the press in 1969, letting them know that the whale was indeed real and had been found. Despite this, though, rather than being put back on display, Ethelbert was given a proper rest. She was buried shortly after she was found, hopefully this time for good. If not, I suppose she'll make an excellent mystery for future explorers in the region. As the story goes, she's buried around the community of Ireland in Washougal, Washington, but the exact whereabouts of her body are thankfully unknown. In 1856, Dr. John Evans, a medical doctor and government-appointed geologist, yes, you're correct, this is a weird combination, who was working for the U.S. Department of the Interior, was sent to Oregon to survey locations for a new railroad route. How a medical doctor becomes a U.S. Department of Interior geologist still confuses me, but he apparently gained wide-ranging acclaim because in Nebraska in 1848 he managed to stumble upon some dinosaur bones, afterwards happily accepting the career change this finding afforded him. Make no mistake, though, he was in no way educated to perform this variety of work. This lack of experience is possibly why, on this expedition, when Evans encountered a large and strange-looking boulder wedged into a hillside between two rivers near modern-day Port Orford, Oregon, he just thought it was a pretty-looking rock and chipped off some small chunks of it, supposedly leaving behind a 22,000-pound pallasite meteorite, an item worth hundreds of millions of dollars if you believe his story. Now, if you don't know what a pallasite is, it's essentially a mineral that's a mix between iron and olivine, and from what I can tell, they form right at the border between the nickel-iron core and rocky mantle of a small planet or large asteroid, and when planets or asteroids manage to be blown to pieces through collisions and whatnot, pallasites can occasionally, rarely, be ejected, and sometimes manage to find their way to the surface of a planet like Earth. Pallasite, for what it's worth, does not naturally form on Earth. Of course, when Evans made his way back to Washington, D.C., it actually seemed like he didn't know exactly what he had on his hands. He ended up donating this pallasite to the Boston Society of Natural History in 1859, and while examining it, a Harvard chemist, one Charles Jackson, found that the specimen were pallasite fragments. Of course, Charles inquired about where Evans got these extremely valuable specimen, and he remarked, of course, that he'd chipped it off a rock wedged somewhere on Bald Mountain. Now, the government was initially thrilled with this finding and was quick to hastily start making plans for another expedition to locate and retrieve this valuable pallasite. But it was 1859 after all, and before they could scramble folks to go on this expedition, two notable things happened. One, on April 12th of 1861, the Civil War began. And then on April 13th of 1861, one day later, Evans died of pneumonia. This put a halt on things for a while, like a long while. It was nearly 70 years, in 1929, when the first of the expeditions were made to locate the pallasite. And while perhaps it didn't help that Evans' notes didn't even contain a map or mention of this boulder he sampled, the teams were unable to find the meteor. Of course, while people come and go, scientific communities remain interested in this sort of thing, and in the 1990s, a new scientific examination of the samples convinced the scientific community at large of something interesting. See, upon examining the pallasite they found, something fishy was up. These samples were essentially identical to those from a Chilean pallasite found in the Atacama Desert of coastal Chile. It's also worth noting these samples were pretty easy to get in the 1850s, and it just so happened that Evans, on his trip to Oregon, didn't pass over the mainland USA to get there, but rather south of it, passing through Panama, where he easily could have procured chunks of the Chilean pallasite. Additionally, further inquiry into Evans himself found that this old doctor may have had motive to set this scheme up. It turns out he had a ton of personal debt that he'd gained from overspending. Now, of course, this motive and the factual basis that the pallasite being found in Oregon was likely a hoax didn't deter people from searching for it, and to this day, meteorite hunters apparently roam the mountains of Oregon, searching for their one-way ticket to a $300 million payout, which may just be split up into fragments across the Atacama Desert and South America in actuality. In Damascus, Oregon, a small farming community about 17 miles west of Portland, Oregon, there's a really strange temple that locally is known as the Temple of Oculus Anubis. You can't enter this place, but I'd be lying if I said the entrance to this home, with an ominous black gate, a statue of the Egyptian god Semet, and 2 stone pyramids, wasn't downright creepy. So what's the story about this creepy place? Does an ancient Egyptian family live here, practicing strange traditions and holding dark rituals? Are there $2 million of underground tunnels and pyramids on the property? Are the local legends true? Well, God, no, they're not true. What are you thinking? However, the place is pretty creepy and is often even billed as the creepiest place of all of Oregon for some reason. If you look up videos taken by trespassers on the property, posted across the web by shady teens, they generally show that the property is laden with unfinished construction, and that there are indeed tunnels on the property, but there aren't $2 million of them, just probably about 100 feet of them, connecting the homes on the property that were meant to be those of the father and son that built the place. Sadly though, while I'd love to tell you that this place is the centerpiece of all that is unholy, the real scary thing about this is that it's essentially a testament to corporate greed and tax evasion rather than anything supernatural. In short, this place was bought by the ex-owner of an eye care clinic in Gresham, Oregon, that had 2.8 stars on Google Maps, which is actually a horrifying prospect. And this place essentially engaged in extremely fraudulent and unethical practices. Patients were frequently double billed. They'd demand patients to do more tests than were necessary, and they'd charge the insurance for procedures that were never performed. These practices, of course, were eventually found out. I think the IRS realized something fishy was going on with the shell of a parent company they had, Oculus Incorporated, and since then, of course, they wanted their money back and demanded settlements for the patients and insurance companies too. By the way, there's another layer to this, with the father, who is now deceased, apparently coercing his son, who may have had autism, into some of these illicit activities. But all in all, it seems this whole situation resolved in the 2010s, and now the temple of Oculus Anubis is, well, not some cult or anything particularly nefarious. It's just a very odd design choice by a couple of doctors that scammed their patients and insurance companies, gracing the front of an unfinished property that will likely remain never finished. So as this story goes, in the 1910s or 1920s, one Francis L. Watrous of Forest Grove was looking for the lost Tillamook mine, a mine that was supposedly worked by a tribe of Native Americans who covered it after white prospectors murdered tribe members over it. You remember the story, I just told it. But Watrous had just started looking for this mine and was inquiring with natives in the area to see if they had any idea about where this mine might lie. And when he asked one elderly individual, he told him a peculiar story passed down through his family that he thought Watrous might appreciate. As the story goes, this grandfather of the elderly Native American individual had come to the Americas with a 2-ship expedition of Portuguese immigrants that planned on establishing a settlement in the Willamette Valley along the Santiam River. This was all around 1845, when Oregon was still dually under British and American occupancy. And as such, being from Europe, they assumed that the British Empire would probably prevail over the Americans long term, and worked out a deal with the Brits to establish their colony. But by the time they made it to Oregon, the British had left the Oregon Territory, and American settlers were pouring into the Oregon Territory off of the Oregon Trail in covered wagons. At this point, they'd already staked out all of the best land in the Willamette Valley, including the prime farmland on which the Portuguese colony intended to settle. This led many of the Portuguese to simply return to Portugal, with only a few individuals remaining with plans to simply trade goods with local natives and also head back to Portugal afterwards. Aboard this ship, some of its cargo were 5 teakwood boxes of golden coins, and they decided, before they went inland to do some trading, to hide the gold in a cache and pick it up after their trading trip, in case they were raided or had it stolen or something. Now, to cache the gold, they anchored offshore from a small creek that ran into the sea and used a rowboat to go ashore with gold and some of the crew members. They had specific instructions on how to hide the gold up the creek, a ways from the sea, and they actually decided to bury the boxes in the creek bed upstream. Of course, this is when tragedy struck. When they returned to shore, a storm rolled in, and their ship was nowhere to be seen. The next day, when the storm passed, they could see their ship at sea, but the anchor was dragging, and nothing seemed to be being done about it. Of course, the ship eventually washed up downshore of them, but at this point it was already being raided by natives, and it seemed there were no survivors. And this left the surviving crew members to fend for themselves. Ultimately, all but one of these surviving crew members passed away, who was the grandfather of the Native American individual I mentioned earlier, and this individual was finally rescued after stumbling into the Eiler family homestead near Gales Creek. Now, the man's grandfather, after this, went on with life, and for a while he seemed to have forgotten about his buried gold. He returned to Portugal, he got married and such, and he seemed to have a good, if uneventful life, but one day he got that itch, and he decided to join the Hudson's Bay Company, making his way back to Oregon and working as a clerk for the company, joined by his wife and son. This son was the elderly native man's father. Now, after 15 years of work, the Portuguese sailor's contract ended, and he decided to move out to the coast of Oregon and begin searching for the gold. Now apparently he was able to find the stream that led to the ocean, but he couldn't quite find the gold itself. Apparently he thought that floods in the region had completely rearranged the landscape. Ultimately, he gave up, and the sailor's son eventually fell in love with a native woman from a local tribe and married her, and they had a child who was the native man who told this story. Now, as with all mysteries on this channel, I have to share the prevailing opinions about it online, and then, of course, my own opinions. To start, this story feels sort of silly in some ways. In particular, there are two parts folks rightfully seem to have an issue with in this story. Number one, why would the Portuguese sail halfway across the world back to Portugal without trying to strike a new deal with the Americans? Number two, why would they bury the gold rather than keep it on their ship where they could defend it? I frankly don't have good answers to either of these questions. All of this being said, though, the story does get right the fact that the drainage small rivers see is enormous in the region, and the drainage they see certainly would have buried or displaced the treasure if it were buried under the creek bed. For these reasons, folks seem to think if the treasure was indeed buried here, which I'm skeptical about, it was likely swept out to sea in the spring after it was buried. However, in the slight chance that it was not buried, based on the descriptions in the story, where do we think it is? Well, folks think the most likely spot would be the Neskowin River, which feeds today into the Neskowin Bay and may have in the past fed directly into the Pacific Ocean, cutting a more straight path in. Now, as for my take on this story, man, you know me. I'm not a fan of stories that come from a single source. Buried treasure, ghost stories, the Bigfoot, you name it. I like resounding agreement. Not an old dude telling me a tale that happened 100 years before he was even born. So I'm slapping this tale with a big no! Oregon, it has been a treat learning more about you. My previous experience with Oregon was a night out in Corvallis that I'll never forget. Or maybe one that I totally forgot. I don't know. I was 22 and dang, you have some really nice craft breweries in that city. Regardless, don't you forget, I'm open to a part 2 here, so let me know in the comments if you want more or if you want me to stop here for now. With this in mind, I just want to say thank you for watching and remind you that whether you just saw an orca breach in the Columbia River or if you tripped and fell on something shiny and yellow out near Gales Creek, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.